Welcome to MyLife, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good Tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer HaTanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC and is dedicated in honor and memory of Rav Yosef Halevi Weinberg Olav HaShalom, Rav Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav HaShalom, and Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav HaShalom. It's also in schus and merit of Rav Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz, Le'erich Yomim V'Shanim Tevis, for many long healthy years. So we are in the middle of chapter 6, Perek Vav of Tanya, discussing the antithesis, the parallel world. Remember, Zeh Lu'uma Zeh Asa Lakim, God created parallel worlds. The whole purpose of existence is to transform the lowest of these worlds into a home for the divine, as we'll learn later in Tanya. Here, the Alter Rebbe is laying out the main building blocks, that there are two worlds, two realities in our lives. In very practical terms, each of us are faced with them all the time. The choice between being a good person or being not a good person. The choice between selfishness and selflessness. The choice between virtue and vice. The choice between self-interest and transcendence. So after explaining at the end of chapter 1 that there is the first soul, which is the animal soul, he went in chapters 2, 3, 4, 5 to explain the divine soul, the Nefesh HaLekis, its very personality, its faculties and its garments. And in chapter 6 he returns now to dissect the anatomy of the animal soul, the one that is self-focused. And it's a critical piece because God created both. We learned at the end of chapter 1, one is not man-made and one is divine. They're both divine, because the whole purpose of creation is that there should be an existence where there is a concealment of the divine and we choose. Or in other terms, the battle between the animal and divine soul. So we've been speaking about now the other parallel, the parallel of what it is like on the side called the animal soul, both the actual soul itself and its faculties that are consumed with self-interest. As he explained in the beginning of the chapter, they come from Klipas Noiga, which is called a nefesh de sitra achra, from the other side, and we'll discuss that momentarily. The klipas nega melubeshes b'dama adam, and there you also have, just as it is in the parallel world of kedusha, of holiness, of the divine soul, faculties and garments, 3 intellectual cognitive faculties and 7 emotional. The same thing with the animal soul. However, its focus is in self, in its own survival, in its own existence, in its own egocentricity instead of divine centricity, being God-centric, which is the contrast. After explaining that in detail, and we learned this in previous shiurim, in the previous classes, so then he speaks about all the thoughts, speeches, and action that a person has in this world that are not focused on the divine, are from the sitra achra, of the other side. And he teaches, what does sitra achra mean? Sad achra she'enet sad ha'kedusha. It doesn't even have to be something that is negative. As soon as it's not dedicated to the very purpose, because it all comes down to driven by the divine purpose of everything. So as soon as it's not that, it's already another side. What is kedusha? So now comes the distinction between kedusha and sitra achra. We discussed this already, but it's worthwhile reviewing again, because what we come away with in the next section that we're going to be learning is a critical perspective on understanding existence. Because everybody asks that big question. How does a good God allow negative things to happen? Where does evil come from? If God is etzem hatev, v'teva hatev lehetiv, God is fundamentally good, and the nature of good is to do goodness, where does all the negativity of life come from? Wars, tensions, hostilities, corruption, abuse. Every form of negative experience, and we know that God created everything. So even though this is not the theme that he's discussing here, how that is the case, but in the process of explaining this negative type of energy, this other side, the Alter Rebbe will also reveal for us in the most fascinating way the dynamics of what allows something to defy God when God himself created that entity, which of course lies at the heart of the whole battle between the animal soul and the divine soul. How is it even possible that an animal soul can exist that is focused on itself and not on the divine? But first we have to state the reality of it, and then comes the understanding of how that comes into being. So the Alter Rebbe explains now what does Kedusha mean and what does Sitra Achra mean. Kedusha means Einei Elo, Sada Kedusha Einei Elo Hashra V'Hamshach Mikdushase Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's nothing but the manifestation from the holiness of the divine, means an entity that is completely subject, completely focused, completely transparent, and not focused on itself, but being a transparent channel of something greater than itself. And that's why in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Sheir El Al Dover Shabbat Letzreis Baruch. God does not rest and reside except something that is receptive to him. And he explained Bein B'Poel, like by Malachim and angels, which we discussed in the previous class, or B'Koyach, potentially by every Ikol Ish Yisrael Lamata. And he brought a proof to Kol Be'asar Shchinta Sharia, that when a person first of all learns Torah, even a person is sitting and learning Torah, the Shekhinah rests there, and even so, that even when they're 10, they come together and they're not studying Torah, they have the potential to be completely dedicated and devoted and committed to the divine, even if it's only in its potential state. But now comes back to the other side. So now we understand what Kedusha is. So Kedusha means a reality that is outside, that is not the God himself, but it's a reality that is an extension of and allows God to flow, godly energy to flow through it. Think of it of containers. Think of the human body. When the circulatory system is working perfectly, the veins, the arteries are, what are they doing? They are transmitting and they are carrying the blood of the heart through the whole body in a very seamless way. If, God forbid, they get blocked or in any way clogged, so then the kelim, the containers, are not allowing the flow to come through. So Kedusha is the healthiest state, the healthiest psychological, spiritual state of a human being. What kind of state is that? Where something that's bottled and therefore it's serving its perfect role. If you have a container and the container has all kinds of other debris in it, it won't be a perfect container to allow wine or any other drink to flow through it, or a pipeline, or any artery. So that's Kedusha. Sitra Achre, however, goes like this, the opposite. Aval kol ma she'eina bot letzlei, something that is not committed, that is not devoted, that is not seamlessly transparent and allowing the energy of the divine Kedusha and holiness to flow through it. So what is that? Kol ma she'eina bot letzlei is baruch, elu dover nifred b'fnei atzmei. It sees itself as an entity of itself, on its own. It's a dover nifred b'fnei atzmei. As a separate entity. Think of a container that is not seeing itself as a perfect channel for the energy that has to flow through it. So now you have a separate entity, because it has its own identity, so can't receive that flow of energy from the holiness of the divine. But he explains what that means, because it does receive energy. As we're going to explain in detail what the specifics. So it says, Mebchinas Pnimius Hagdusha Mohusa Vatzmusa Bekveda Ba'atzma. Alter Rebbe, how many words does he use here? Pnimius Hagdusha Mohusa Vatzmusa Bekveda Ba'atzma. The Pnimius Hagdusha, the inner dimension of the divine, and Mohusa Vatzmusa, its core and essence, Bekveda Ba'atzma, in its glory and in its core, and it's an essential state. In different ways to translate it. One way to translate it is from the inner essential core and the splendorous, and you can even say majesty of holiness itself. Because the container here, or the entity, feels it senses itself, perceives itself as a separate entity. And is not subjugated or surrendered or in any way being completely sublimated to the divine energy that's supposed to flow through it. So then the question is, how does it exist? Nothing can exist without the divine energy. So he goes on, Elam Mebchinas Acharayim. In contrast to Pnimius Hagdusha, it receives the Acharayim. Acharayim means from its back end, from its behind side, which means a very narrow flow. The example being, as discussed in the previous class, the example being when you love somebody and they are completely receptive to the gift you want to give them. So then you give it to them with your full heart. You look at them, you gaze at them, you smile at them. But let's say you have to give them something and you're not interested in doing so because they defy you. They're not interested. They're not receptive to you. Now, why do you still have to give them energy? Because God wants to create a world like ours that we'll learn about later. So how can you give energy with the same type of attitude? So we call it mebchinas acharayim, as if you're throwing something over your back. Almost like you're turning your back to the person. You're giving it to them, but very reluctantly, so to speak. Now, that's not a good word to use l'mayla by God, because God doesn't have to do it, but he wants to do it, because he wants to create a reality that has its own self, and that ultimate reality should come to recognize the animal soul and everything that this world that constitutes should come to recognize the divine. That's the work that we need to do. But on its own, it's receiving energy, but it's from acharayim. That's what he says here, from the backside. So mebchinas acharayim, and now he breaks it down into detail. So though we learned this inside everything we've said so far, it's worthwhile going through the details, because you see here in the classic Alter Rebbe's fascinating style, breaks it down into the minutest detail exactly how this process works. Because it's complicated. You have to understand, this is divine energy. Kedusha, in a way, very simple. Well, simple. It's not simple because it takes work to get to that place, but it's simple logically. Something is healthy, so the containers, the channels, are flowing openly and allowing the divine holiness to shine through them. That's called Kedusha. It's bottled, completely like a student, completely committed to his teacher, so he's able to receive and allow the teacher's ideas to flow through this person. But if there's an ego and there's a self-interest involved, that blocks it. So what exactly is happening in this energy of mebchinas acharayim? What happens to it? We understand now the energy is not coming in full flow. It's coming in a more diminished state. But what does that diminishment consist of? Continues the Alter Rebbe. Sheyerdim mimadrega lemadrega. The life force in these negative things that have a self-interest, or that are the egocentric consciousness of existence, says the life force in them descends from the holiness. Everything comes from God's holiness. So it descends, madrega lemadrega, revovis madregas b'ishtalshel sa'elamis. So the first thing, madrega lemadrega, step by step. So yes, the flow is now flowing, but it's going step by step, which means in gradations. And how many steps? Revovis madregas, tens of thousands of times, tens of thousands of such steps. But they're not just equal steps. Every step creates a little more diminishment of this flow. B'ishtalshus elamis, in the spiral of the cosmic order of the spiritual worlds. So if you want to dissect and understand the process of that energy flow, you have to go through Seder Ishtalshus and understand as it gets more diminished and more diminished. So using the analogy I gave before with the student and the teacher. So it's in the tzad kedusha and holiness, it's straightforward. What happens is that the student is listening and completely absorbed by the teacher. But let us say, for whatever reason, the student is a little distracted. That's like going madrega lemadrega. It's a lower level student. And the energy, therefore, is not flowing quite the same way, because he's not the same type of vessel and container. And it goes now tens of thousands of levels through this whole cosmic order. That's how we'll come to understand the existence of consciousness, a consciousness that is beyond, outside of, and separate from the divine consciousness. That's how the Alter Rebbe that's what he's explaining now. But then he goes further. It doesn't just, this we just said is the level after level, step by step, through the entire order. But he explains what those steps and how do those steps connect to each other. Because here we still have to understand, how does he get from a place that was completely absorbed by the divine, completely transparent, completely selfless, to becoming a self. So he says it goes derech ila v'olol. It goes through a state of cause and effect. What is cause and effect is? So the cause would be a higher level, the effect would be a lower level. A classic example, speech and thought and speech. So thought is a cause. You think, and then you speak. So as much as speech conveys what the thought wants to convey, it's still going to be limited because speech is ultimately more tangible and can't quite capture. We can't always express the deepest feelings and thoughts we have in our heart. So there you see a diminishment. So it is cause and effect. This is vital. There's no severing. There's no quantum leap here. Besides the Tzimtzum Arishon, which we shall discuss later, which is the first initial leap. But in the process, the energy is flowing step by step. The steps are connected to each other and the cause and effect. But there are going to be many steps. But then he adds with Tzimtzumim Rabim. So many cause and effect transitions, and Tzimtzumim Rabim diminished many times. So it's not just cause and effect, because you can have cause and effect and say, okay, step by step, the lower step is lower than the higher step, but it's not necessarily that diminished. No, but it's diminished with Tzimtzumim Rabim, not just cause and effect, Tzimtzumim Rabim. So on one hand, it's a cause and effect, a causal relationship, which is cause and effect. On the other hand, it's through many Tzimtzumim, a multitude of diminishments, many times. So far we have, it goes madrega, tens of thousands of levels and steps in this cosmic order, in the spiral of the stages. Shtalshlus, also from the word shalshelis, like a chain. So every link of the chain is linked with the previous link. But in links in the chain, they could all be exactly the same level. Here, each link is an effect of the cause of the link above it, at the same time also being diminished. So even though the lowest link is going to be linked to the highest one, but it's in a far more diminished state. Tzimtzumim Rabim. Ad, to the extent, to the point, shenismayet kol kach ha'er v'achayis, to the point that the energy, the divine light and energy, that's the original source of Kedusha and holiness, to the extent that it is diminished, diminishment after diminishment, again, you see again the repetition, like he said, Tzimtzumim Rabim, many diminishments. So he says, miyut achamiyut, diminishment after diminishment, this energy, ad sheyochel is samtzimul islabish b'pchinas golus. To the extent that it can be diminished and garbed and enclosed and manifest in a state of exile and displacement. So till now, we've been talking about diminished states. We haven't yet talked about something that is antithetical to the divine. You could say, okay, it's not as much energy as it was on a higher level. The student at the lowest level is still receiving the teachings of the teacher, in the analogy I'm using earlier, but it's in a diminished state, but we don't have yet Golus. But as it diminishes more and more through all these levels, it comes to the point that it's capable of being diminished, and not just diminished, but mislabish. Because it's entering into that reality, into that consciousness, in a state of spiritual displacement, Golus, or sometimes referred to exile. Where within that entity, that autonomous entity that senses itself, its own consciousness as separate from any other consciousness, and especially from a divine consciousness. So here you have the process. And God wanted it to be done in a way that we should understand it. Of course, He can do it, Kol Yochel, God can do anything He wants. But He wanted this to be in a way that we can understand it. So here's how it works. It starts off all in Kedusha and holiness. It goes through all these stages, and it said level after level, cause and effect, all the diminishments, to the point that gets diminished so that it can enter into something that is of a different consciousness, that is separate, that senses itself separately from the divine. So even though the divine remains within it, as we're going to learn soon, especially in the gloss, in the Haggadah and Tanya, but it's now we can understand how something can be receiving energy from God and still receiving it in a way where it senses itself as a self-conscious, its own entity, its own separate entity. And now the Alter Rebbe adds, really, in a sense, to answer a question. Why do we need this whole process? The answer is because we need to sustain even this reality, even the egocentric reality. So he continues, this energy is enough energy to sustain it, to energize and sustain that thing's existence from nothing to something, because it wouldn't exist. Later in Shar Yechid V'Amunah, the second section of Tanya, is going to explain nothing can exist without the divine energy. And this means nothing. Even something that defies God, even something that is not bottled, like he said, that is not subjugated, that is not a receptacle receiving and absorbing the divine. So everything needs, because it doesn't have any merit of its own and value of its own. But now we understand how that's possible. To keep it sustained, to prevent this entity, this egocentric entity, this independent consciousness entity, to prevent it from reverting to be null and void, as it was in its primordial state before it was created. And as I said, in Shar Yechid V'Amunah, he elaborates on that. That if the divine words, if the divine words, God forbid, were removed for one moment, basically you stop breathing, you stop speaking, the thing that's created through your speech stops being. You don't need to make any extra effort. So everything needs this type of energy. Now, had the Alter Rebbe not written these words, the idea is still understood, but now it completes the circle, understanding. So why is that understand that everything needs divine energy, but here we also understand how could divine energy sustain and energize something which is its own consciousness, which is not divine. Kedusha, we understand, because Kedusha is a complete receptacle receiving that divine energy. In contrast to Sitra Achra, the other side, what he calls a Dover Nifrid. Okay. And now the Alter Rebbe then now defines something which, on one hand, when you read it the first time, is shocking. On the other hand, when you read it, it also gives you clarity about the reality of this world. And one of the first things, a little preface before we read on, one of the first things when we grow from children into adults and we lose our innocence at some point is the discovery of a world that is not exactly a perfect world. You discover a person that can lie to you, duplicity, abuse, hurt, trauma, of all forms, whether it's extreme or even moderate and even more covert. The very fact that one person can hurt another, deliberately, not deliberately, if you think about it, the first time a child sees that, it has to be, that itself is a traumatic experience. Just to come to that type of thing. Because a child sees the world in a beautiful way. Beautiful parents, beautiful siblings, family being nurtured. You suddenly enter and see the world can be hostile, can be angry, can be vile. I'm not even going to the worst scenarios. Even, as I said, more subtle levels. So when you first see that, it can be a tremendously disconcerting, is a mild word, tremendously demoralizing experience. And of course, who hasn't written about it? Thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of books and songs and poems and ideas have all been about this idea of how do we deal with such a world? How do we even understand such a world? And especially in the face of a divine truth, a higher divine holiness and goodness, it becomes even more troubling. So the Alter Rebbe now, citing Eitz Chaim, says, but now that we understand this dynamic of how something can exist, which God creates and continues to create, however, through an energy from the backside that goes through all the diminishments and all the stages we learned, the steps, the cause and effect, the diminishments, to the point that can energize and sustain and manifest within something that is so-called, feels itself separate from anything except itself. So now he says, Ulechein nikra elam hazeh. Listen to this. And therefore this world, umeloyoi, and its contents, meaning not just the world, everything within the world, everything this world contains and is comprised of. What is it called? Elam ha-klippos v'sitra achra. It's called a world of klippos and sitra achra, a world of husks, shells, coverings, and the other side. That's what the world is defined as. Now you'll say, one second, how can you define the whole world that way? There are many beautiful people, many beautiful actions happening. But we're talking about the state of existence, that it's capable of existing on and feeling itself as a self. Not even if someone's not perpetrating evil or injustice. The mere fact that a world can exist, like we said before, it doesn't have to be heipach ha'kedusha, the opposite of kedusha. The mere fact that it's not completely sublimated and absorbed and channeling the divine, that turns it into a world of klippos and sitra achra. Basically, potentially, every human being can turn into something that we don't like to see, the uglier side. Does that mean everyone does? Absolutely not. Just like we said before, with Gedusha means there are things that are actually completely absorbed with the divine and the divine holiness, and things that are perhaps not, but they potentially can be. The same as the opposite. In this world, potentially anything is, in a way, can defy God. In actuality, that's the choices we make. So he calls it Elam ha-klippos v'sitra achra. The natural existence of our reality is self. You wake up in the morning, you don't need to make any effort. You feel yourself. You feel your needs. It's through your work that you come to realize there's another person. You need to be civil. You need to show gratitude. You need to be giving and gracious. But on our own, the nature of existence, all you have to do is open up contemporary psychology. Even though Freud may not be the father of psychology that everyone agrees with, people totally disagree with him, but he's still the guy to disagree with. And his essential psychology is the psychology of the id, of self, or in the words of Richard Dawkins, the selfish gene. Very existence is about self. Now that can be harnessed, it could be controlled, or like through the ego and superego, or you can act on it. But that's the very nature of existence, and the Alter Rebbe is acknowledging that. The thing is, we're going to learn there's also another part, the tzad kedusha, the divine soul. Not just the id, but the yid. But the fact of the matter is that this is the definition of existence. And for that reason, all the affairs of this world are tough and evil, and wicked men prevail. This explains the big question. How is that possible? As explained and stated in Eitz Chaim from the Arizal, section 42, at the end of chapter 4. So how do we understand it? As a result of the energy being diminished to this point. So we're going to stop here, even though it's always good to stop in a positive way. And the positive way is the whole purpose of this is to transform it, which we'll discuss in the coming shiurim. Everyone have a good week, a good tavach. TanyaApply.com, where all these programs can be viewed, and they're all archived. You could also pose your questions there. Be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApply.com for archived classes and more resources.